The desert wind carried more than dust. It carried memory. The Apache knew this better than anyone, for the mesas, canyons, and high plains of the Southwest were not just their home, they were a living part of who they were. The dry earth cracked beneath bare feet, but to the Apache it was not barren. It was alive with hidden springs, hunting trails, and medicine plants known only to those who had walked it for generations. From the Rio Grande in the east to the Sierra Madre in the south, they roamed like shadows, moving with the rhythm of the seasons. The land forged them into what they became, a people unyielding, resourceful, and cunning. Life here was no easy task, and yet the Apache thrived where others faltered. They hunted deer in the mountain forests, gathered mesquite beans and agave in the valleys, and learned to endure the merciless sun with the patience of stone. They were masters of mobility, never staying too long in one place, and this fluid way of life made them nearly impossible for their enemies to pin down. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they brought with them two things that would forever alter the balance of power: the horse and the gun. The horse became more than a beast of burden. It became the beating heart of Apache warfare. Swift, enduring, and fierce, mounted Apache warriors could appear like a storm out of nowhere, strike hard, and vanish into the canyons before a single soldier could reload his musket. And the gun, though at first a weapon of their enemies, quickly became theirs as well, traded, stolen, and mastered with lethal precision. The Spanish called them Apacheria, land of the Apache, and feared them as raiders. To the Apache, raiding was not merely theft, it was survival, a way to provide for their families in a land where the soil was stingy and water scarce. To strike fast and disappear was both a necessity and a skill passed down from father to son. It was also an act of defiance, for each raid reminded their enemies that the Apache would not bow quietly to any foreign crown. And yet, even in this rugged life of struggle, there was beauty. Around their fires, under the same stars that had guided their ancestors, the Apache told stories of spirits and warriors long gone. Their spiritual world was woven tightly into the land. Every mountain peak and every hidden spring was sacred. The shaman, or medicine man, was a keeper of this sacred bond, guiding his people with visions, chants, and rituals that tied the Apache to the eternal rhythms of earth and sky. To fight for their land was not just to fight for survival, it was to fight for their soul. For centuries, conflict ebbed and flowed. With the Mexicans who inherited Spanish lands after 1821, the Apache clashed as often as they traded. Sometimes there was peace, but more often there was blood. Apache raids struck fear into Mexican villages, while Mexican soldados hunted them mercilessly in return, sometimes offering bounties for Apache scalps. It was a cycle as old as the desert winds: attack, pursuit, retreat, and revenge. Then in 1848, the winds shifted again. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the vast northern lands of Mexico were ceded to the United States. For the Apache, this change of rulers did not mean peace. It meant the arrival of a new adversary, one that seemed endless in number and relentless in determination. The Americans came with surveyors, settlers, and soldiers. They drew lines on maps that ignored the hidden trails and sacred mountains of the Apache. They built forts where the Apache had once gathered water, and they made promises. Promises of peace, promises of shared land, promises of respect that were broken as quickly as they were spoken. The Apache watched as their world began to shrink. Each treaty signed was a wound. Each fort built was a chain tightening around their neck. To the U.S. government, the Apache were to be confined, restrained, and remade into something they were not: farmers on barren reservations, dependent on rations and controlled by agents who did not know their ways. But the Apache were not a people who surrendered easily. Their very history was a history of resistance. From the moment the Spanish crossed the Rio Grande, from the days when Mexican soldiers hunted them across the Sierra Madre, they had learned one lesson above all: survival demanded defiance. So when the United States extended its hand with one treaty after another, when soldiers rode deeper into their homeland, and when settlers raised fences across the open range, the Apache did what they had always done: they fought. And thus the desert itself became a battlefield. Every canyon a hiding place, every ridge a lookout, every rider a ghost who could strike from the shadows. For the Apache, this fight was not just for land, it was for freedom. It was for the right to remain who they were, children of the desert, unbroken, unyielding, untamed. The mid-19th century was a turning point for the Apache, a moment when old wounds deepened and a new warpath was carved across the Southwest. With the Americans now in control of lands once ruled by Mexico, the Apache found themselves surrounded by forts, patrols, and settlers hungry for gold, cattle, and farmland. At first, there were gestures of peace. U.S. officials extended treaties, paper documents filled with promises of safe land, food, and protection. Yet, time after time, those promises were broken. The circle of trust shattered like glass beneath a boot heel. One event in 1861 set the stage for decades of bloodshed: the Bascom affair. A rancher's boy had been kidnapped, likely by a band of Coyotero Apaches. But the U.S. Army chose to lay blame on the Chiricahua and their leader, Cochise. Captain George Bascom summoned Cochise to Fort Buchanan under a flag of truce. Cochise arrived with his family expecting dialogue. Instead, Bascom tried to seize him. Cochise drew his knife, slashed through the tent wall, and fled into the desert, leaving his family in enemy hands. To the Apache, this betrayal was an unforgivable stain on the sacred honor of parley. The Bascom affair ignited a war of vengeance. Cochise struck back with ambushes along the Butterfield Overland Mail route, setting stagecoaches ablaze and scattering frightened passengers across the desert sands. American soldiers retaliated with executions, hanging Apache captives in reprisal. What began as a single misunderstanding festered into open war. The fragile bridge between Apache and American collapsed entirely, and in its ruins rose decades of conflict. Cochise was no ordinary chief. He was tall, commanding, and carried himself with a dignity that demanded respect. His raids were swift and devastating, but he was also a negotiator when honor allowed. To his people, he was more than a leader. He was the embodiment of their will to remain free. Under Cochise, the Chiricahua learned to wield the desert itself as a weapon. They struck from hidden ravines, vanished into high canyons, and left soldiers wandering thirsty under the merciless sun. The American press painted Cochise and his warriors as bloodthirsty savages, but for the Apache, the story was one of betrayal. They had come under a flag of truce and been deceived. They had signed treaties and watched them crumble. How could they trust words written in ink when they had seen them washed away in blood? Even beyond the Chiricahua, other Apache groups felt the tightening noose. The Mescalero, the Jicarilla, the Warm Springs, each band faced the same encroachment. Land was confiscated for ranches, sacred hunting grounds fenced off for cattle. Soldiers herded Apache families onto barren reservations where the soil was poor and rations often failed to arrive. Hunger gnawed at bellies. Disease spread in cramped camps. And yet, even in exile, the Apache spirit refused to yield. There were moments when peace seemed possible. After years of war, Cochise finally accepted a treaty in 1872, one that allowed his people to remain on a reservation in their own beloved mountains rather than be shipped to distant plains. This was a rare victory, a moment when the Apache believed they could preserve their way of life under their own sky. But such victories were fleeting. After Cochise's death in 1874, the U.S. government abandoned even that agreement, closing the Chiricahua reservation and forcing his people elsewhere. Once more, the circle was broken. To the Apache, these betrayals were more than political games. They were insults to the sacred bond of word and honor. In Apache culture, a promise spoken carried the weight of life itself. To break it was to dishonor one's ancestors and call down the judgment of spirits. And so, when the Americans broke promise after promise, it was not only a theft of land, it was an assault on Apache identity, their very sense of truth. This constant deception fueled anger that smoldered like a coal under ashes, waiting to burst into flame. For the Apache, war was not a choice they sought. It was a choice forced upon them, again and again, by broken words and empty hands. And as the 1870s unfolded, the struggle only deepened. Out of these betrayals rose a new generation of warriors, men who would carve their names into the annals of the frontier: Victorio, Geronimo, Jew, names that still echo across the canyons today. The story of the Apache in these years is not merely one of battle, but of a trust forever betrayed, of a circle broken and never restored. It was the moment when the Apache came to understand that the fight ahead was not just for land, but for their very right to exist. By the 1870s, the Southwest was burning. Every canyon, every trail, every isolated ranch could become a stage for bloodshed. The Apache resistance, once scattered, now surged with a new fury, guided by leaders whose names struck fear across the frontier. Among them were Victorio, Geronimo, and Ua, men who embodied the unyielding will of their people. Victorio of the Warm Springs Apache was a master strategist, a warrior who fought not only with his rifle, but with the terrain itself. He knew every waterhole, every ravine, every hidden pass of New Mexico's mountains. To the U.S. Army, he was a ghost, slipping through their fingers time and again. His campaigns were desperate, driven by the refusal to see his people confined to a barren reservation. With only a few hundred followers, Victorio defied entire regiments, striking forts, stage lines, and ranches before melting back into the desert. His fight was one of defiance and despair, and though he was eventually hunted down in 1880 in Mexico, his memory lingered, a reminder that the Apache would never surrender quietly. And then there was Geronimo. Unlike Victorio, who was known for his strategy, Geronimo was remembered for his mystique. Born Goyacla of the Chiricahua, he earned the name Geronimo in battle when terrified Mexican soldiers cried out to Saint Jerome for protection against his fury. To his people, he was more than a warrior. He was a medicine man, a spiritual leader said to have visions that foretold enemy movements. Some swore bullets could not touch him. To soldiers, this reputation made him a phantom, a nightmare figure who seemed to command the desert itself. Geronimo led bands of warriors deep into Mexico, launching raids that stretched American and Mexican armies to their breaking point. He could vanish into the Sierra Madre for months, only to return with thunderous raids that left settlers trembling in their cabins and officers fuming at their maps. Newspapers seized upon these tales, often painting Geronimo as a savage demon, a symbol of untamed barbarism. But for the Apache, he was a protector, a man who carried the grief of his murdered family and turned it into a fire that refused to be extinguished. The settlers, caught in between, lived in constant fear. Isolated homesteads along the frontier became targets for raids. Cattle stolen, supplies burned, men killed. Women and children were sometimes taken captive, not always out of cruelty, but as bargaining chips for the release of Apache prisoners. These stories spread like wildfire in the press, often stripped of their nuance, until the Apache were seen by much of the American public as bloodthirsty marauders who threatened civilization itself. But the truth was far more complex. Apache raids were not random acts of savagery. They were survival. With rations withheld on reservations, with hunting grounds fenced off, with families starving, raiding became the only means to provide. Every attack was not only a strike against the enemy, but an attempt to keep their people alive. The U.S. Army, for its part, responded with overwhelming force. Cavalry regiments rode out with repeating rifles, Gatling guns, and endless supplies. Scouts, often Apaches from rival bands, were hired to track their kin across the desert. The irony was bitter. Apache fighting Apache, pressed into service by a government that sought to eradicate them as a free people. These scouts knew the land, knew the tricks of concealment, and became invaluable to commanders desperate to corner their elusive foes. And yet, even with all their numbers and weapons, victory was never easy. Geronimo and his followers could slip into canyons so narrow that cavalry horses could not follow. They could endure weeks on scraps of food, drinking from hidden springs, traveling by night and resting by day. Their very endurance mocked the might of the U.S. Army. Still, the toll was immense. Every raid brought retaliation. Every victory carried loss. Apache families lived on the edge of annihilation, always moving, always hunted, their children growing up with the sound of gunfire echoing through the night. For every tale of Geronimo's daring escape, there was another of Apache women and children captured, bound, and marched to distant reservations. The frontier was drenched in fear. To settlers, the Apache were a nightmare that would not fade. To soldiers, they were an enemy unlike any other, one that refused to fight on open ground, one that seemed immune to defeat. And to the Apache themselves, they were a people fighting not for conquest, not for gold, not for empire, but for the last scraps of freedom in a land that had always been theirs. By the early 1880s, the war had reached a fever pitch. Apache raids stretched deep into Mexico, while American troops built fort after fort, drawing tighter the noose around their enemies. Yet the Apache, though few in number, refused to bend. They fought with fire in their eyes and the desert at their back, knowing full well that each raid might be their last. The Wild West was not merely a stage of cowboys and cattle drives, saloons and six guns. It was also this, a war of attrition, a clash of wills, where a people who called themselves Nde, the people, chose to fight rather than vanish quietly into the dust. By the 1880s, the war between the Apache and the United States had dragged on for more than 2 decades. It was a struggle of endurance, small bands of warriors and their families against the vast machinery of an expanding nation. The odds had always been long, but now the desert grew heavy with inevitability. The circle was closing. Fort after fort dotted the Apache homeland. Telegraph lines stretched across plains that had once been silent, carrying orders faster than any rider could travel. Cavalry columns, sometimes numbering thousands, crisscrossed the frontier. Soldiers were no longer lone detachments. They were armies that shadowed the smallest whisper of an Apache trail. Even Mexico, weary of Apache raids that had bled its northern provinces for generations, joined in the hunt. There was no refuge left. And yet Geronimo endured. With barely 30 warriors and their families, he eluded more than 5,000 American and Mexican troops sent to track him down. His movements seemed guided by instinct, by visions that some believed came from the spirits themselves. Soldiers cursed him as a phantom, a wraith who could vanish into the Sierra Madre's labyrinth of peaks and ravines. To his people, he was still their protector, the last ember of freedom flickering against the oncoming storm. But embers cannot burn forever. In the summer of 1886, Geronimo found himself surrounded in the Sierra Madre, his people worn thin by hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless pursuit of soldiers. He had fled, surrendered, and fled again before. But now even his own warriors were weary. They pressed him to end it. The cost of freedom, measured in blood and tears, had grown unbearable. On September 4, 1886, Geronimo surrendered to General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. It was a moment heavy with history, one that marked the final chapter of the Apache Wars. Eyewitnesses remember Geronimo's face that day, lined, proud, but shadowed with grief. He is said to have spoken with sorrow, not only for himself but for all his people. Once I moved about like the wind. Now I surrender to the white man. We were once a proud nation. Now we are prisoners of war. The war had not ended in a climactic battle. There was no final victory to be sung in triumph. Instead, it ended with a weary surrender in a desolate canyon, an ending that carried the weight of tragedy. But if the surrender was bitter, what followed was crueler still. Geronimo and his band were promised they would be reunited with their families on reservations in Arizona. Instead, they were deceived. Loaded onto trains, they were shipped east as prisoners of war, first to Florida, then to Alabama, and later to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, elders stripped from the lands of their ancestors. For a people whose identity was bound to the desert mountains and the sacred springs of the Southwest, exile was more than a change of place. It was a severing of the soul. The air of Florida was damp and heavy, the forests foreign and suffocating. Disease swept through the camps, claiming lives faster than bullets had. The people who had survived endless war now found themselves dying in captivity, far from the red earth and wide skies of their homeland. The psychological toll was profound. To the Apache, the land was sacred, woven into their prayers, their songs, their very names. Torn from it, they felt unmoored, like trees ripped from their roots. Some elders refused to eat, withering away in silent grief. Mothers wept for children buried in strange soil, denied the comfort of resting beneath the mountains that had cradled generations before them. Even Geronimo, once the most feared warrior of the frontier, lived out his final years as a prisoner. Though he became a celebrity of sorts, appearing in Wild West shows, even riding in Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration parade, he was never again free. His heart remained in the deserts of Arizona, where he longed to return but never could. He died at Fort Sill in 1909, an old man whose very name had become legend, yet who died in chains. The last stand of the Apache was not a single battle, but a slow suffocation. It was the steady loss of land, the grinding weight of betrayal, the final exile that stripped them of more than territory. It stripped them of the right to live as themselves. And yet, even in defeat, something endured. The Apache spirit, though battered, was not extinguished. It lingered in the songs whispered around campfires, in the stories passed to children, in the unbroken will of a people who had endured the impossible. Their weapons had been taken, their lands seized, but their memory, their identity, remained. The last stand had ended, but the legacy of that fight was only beginning. The guns of the frontier eventually fell silent, but silence does not mean forgetting. The Apache wars had ended, Geronimo's band had been exiled, and the great chiefs and warriors were gone. Yet their story did not fade into the dust. It lingered, an echo across the desert canyons, a whisper in the winds that still sweep over the mesas at dusk. The Apache were never truly conquered, not in spirit. Though confined to reservations, though stripped of their homeland, their culture and memory endured. To this day, the descendants of those warriors still live in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, carrying forward traditions of song, ceremony, and language that their ancestors fought so desperately to preserve. In their prayers, the old gods of the mountains are still honored. In their dances, the rhythm of survival still beats. Geronimo himself became more than a man. He became a legend, a name that outlived both his captors and his enemies. To the U.S. government and settlers of his time, he had been a menace, the embodiment of resistance. To his people, he remained a protector, a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds. Even today, his name is shouted by soldiers leaping from airplanes, invoked as a cry of daring and defiance. The irony is sharp. A man who fought against the United States now remembered as a symbol of its military spirit. History often twists in such ways. But the deeper truth lies not in the legend, but in the human cost. The Apache fight for freedom was not a romantic tale of lone warriors against the odds. It was the slow unraveling of families, the forced marches of children, the hunger of reservations where promises rotted like spoiled meat. It was a trail of tears carved not only into the land, but into the memory of a people. And yet from that trail of tears came resilience. The Apache did not vanish, as many predicted they would. They adapted. They endured. They carried forward their identity even when stripped of their weapons and their land. Today, Apache communities still honor the code of survival that sustained them in the harshest times. Mobility, resourcefulness, and a fierce commitment to family and freedom. The Wild West is often remembered for its gunfighters and outlaws, its cattle drives and gold rushes. But the Apache story reminds us that the West was also a place of profound loss, where nations were broken and cultures tested. It is a reminder that progress often came with chains, and that the price of empire was measured in human sorrow. And so, the question remains, were the Apache truly defeated? Or do their spirits still ride on the desert winds, whispering across the canyons, reminding us that freedom, once fought for, never wholly dies? The sun sets over the jagged peaks of Arizona. The sky turns red, then deepens into shadow. Somewhere the wind stirs the dry grass, carrying with it the faint memory of hooves, of drums, of voices raised in defiance. The Apache may have walked their trail of tears, but their story, etched into the very stones of the desert, remains unbroken. The desert remembers, and so must we.